Hi, welcome back to class. And you just finished working on your survey of Matthew's Gospel, and I want to spend a few minutes going over with this. Note also that the hard copy notes are located right under the link to this video in our class. So pull out the notes. And I also, before we go any further, I want you to stop the video and reread Matthew 1:1 to 17. It's crucial when we're talking about the text that you have the text in mind and opened up in front of you because, again, I'm the teacher, but I could be wrong. By the way, you could be wrong too. And so our judge for the correctness of our surveys and then as we go further, our interpretations is going to be how well does our work actually describe the text enough that if somebody else were to open up their text and read along, they would agree with what we were saying. Okay, so make sure you have the text in front of you and that you've read it. Okay, welcome back. Now let's jump in here. Now, again, for next week, we're going to do exactly the same thing we just did for Matthew, but do it for 1:18 all the way through chapter 2. So we're going to do the same assignment on a different part of Matthew's gospel for next week to get some more practice on survey. So let's look at Matthew's genealogy. Okay, again, the first thing you do is you go through and name paragraph titles. I'm skipping that part, and I'm just jumping right to the main units and subunits and talking about structure because I want to keep the video short. Okay, so first let's look at main units. It appears to me, after several readings, that Matthew's genealogy breaks up into three pieces. Now, how do we get that? Well, let's note a couple of things here about it. Verse 1, which was, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, and son of Abraham. That's more like a summary statement or some kind of a general statement. And we might also observe at the last verse. Starts with, the translation I'm using, the today's New International says, thus, and then it also gives a summary, and it uses this number 14. There's 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to exile, and from the exile to the Christ. So verse 1 and verse 17, both in their own ways are broad statements. And then what's interesting is in the middle of this, verses 2 all the way to 16, is we have the genealogy proper, where you have the so-and-so begat so-and-so. So that material obviously goes together in the middle, and essentially we have first verse that serves as a superscription, a general statement that gives us the three key titles for who Jesus is. And then the last verse gives us sort of a concluding summary that then lays a grid over the genealogy in terms of showing that there's a pattern in terms of how many generations exist in each of these three groupings. So there's 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, and from exile to Jesus. Now, what's interesting about this genealogy? Probably a couple things. You probably noticed that in the middle of the genealogy, we actually have a reference to a historical event, the exile. That seems a little bit odd for a genealogy, so we want to note that. And we notice that it makes that verse 17 makes a big deal out of it, that you have actually 14 generations. Okay. The other thing that you probably noticed was that at key places in the genealogy itself, we have references to 5 females in what is otherwise a overwhelmingly male-centric genealogy. And those 5 females are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah. Notice the wording there. It's not on purpose, or not. That is definitely on purpose. And we have Mary. And we'll talk about each of these in a minute. But we have Tamar shows up in this section here, on this side of David. We also have Ruth up in this section. And then we have in the second part, we have David, who's father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So we have wife of Uriah that shows up here. And then we have Rahab. Oh, I forgot Rahab. Rahab's up here too with Ruth. And then we have Mary in this section. So notice we have recurrence of women that shows up in this. Now this is significant, and this is going to be a major structure. So we actually have the recurrence of women. And this one is a major structure because of the 50% rule. Remember, a major structure either connects two or more main units or controls 50% of the material. And in this case, our second main unit is verses 2 to 16. That's way over 50%. And so this recurrence becomes a major recurrence. So we have the recurrence of women. Okay, that's a fairly easy, obvious structure to note. Now, the two other most obvious structures, I think, have to do with how verse 1 connects to the rest and how verse 17 connects to the rest. Let's talk about verse 1 first of all. Verse 1 is a general statement. So this is going to be the structure of particularization. Verse 1 functions by stating up front in a general way who Jesus is and what this genealogy is about. And who is Jesus? We have three titles. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of David, and the Son of Abraham. And as you observe in the genealogy, those are the very particulars that are traced out, that show precisely through a genealogy how it is that Jesus is these three elements. Now, some of you may have noticed that this genealogy, the way this unpacks, that this is a chiasm. Remember chiasm? That's the structure where you have ABC, BA, or ABC, CBA, or ABA, BA. It's a kind of recurrence that goes in reverse. And so, in this case, it starts off Christ, David, Abraham, and then the genealogy itself goes in reverse order. Abraham, David, Christ. This is a chiasm. So this is a particularization by chiasm. And you can see in the notes how I trace that out. So we have A, B, C, C, B, A. That's particularization. Now, the last verse. It's, I think in this case, a summary. It's a more specific than a general statement because it doesn't just give names. It actually uses this number 14 as a grid. So I'm going to call that summarization. And I think that's the best title for this last verse. So we have, this is a summary statement. And it's a summarization that also has a causal element. Notice that word thus. It's in the Greek also, and some of our English translations don't have it, but at the beginning of verse 17, it ought to say therefore or thus. And so what structure would that be? That's going to be causation. So verse 17 connects to the rest of these other units by means of causation with summarization, or summarization with causation. In other words, the cause is the actual genealogy, and the effect then is exactly what is summarized here, that God has worked through history to bring Jesus. This 14 is important because what does it highlight? It highlights the exile. What is exile doing in the middle of a genealogy? Exile was the worst thing that happened to God's people in the Old Testament. And what Jesus' genealogy testifies to is that God worked through it. And in fact, if you look back through Israel's history, yes, the genealogy or the exile was a train wreck. However, God brought the Messiah through that anyway. And in fact, this 14 pattern actually required the exile. So God was able to even use this bad event as part of the plan to bring Jesus, which tells us then what? That God isn't finished and that the kingdom really is here. Jesus is going to announce that in a few chapters, but that God has worked through history to bring about his salvation, and that in fact God isn't done with his people, that exile really is over, and that something exciting is about to happen. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So we have summarization with causation. Again, the cause is the genealogy. The effect is the summary that uses this 14 as a grid work. What's another structure? Well, a couple of things. I think we can make a structure. There's a couple of contrasts here. And first of all, I think there's a contrast with a climax. The actual climax of the genealogy is verse 16, where we have more space given to talking about Jesus than any other person. So we have Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. That brings our genealogy clearly to a climax, but there's some contrasting elements here. It contrasts in two ways. First, by space. More space is given to the report about Jesus' birth than anything else. And it's also a contrast that there's no link between actually Jesus' father and Jesus himself. So here we have a contrast a little different in terms of how the birth is presented. We have Mary as Joseph's wife, but it nowhere says that Joseph is Jesus' dad. So this stands in contrast from the rest of the genealogy. And those are the structures. Again, you may have more, and you're going to be free to ask some questions about your structures, but those are the major structures that I found. Now, what I want you also to look at now in the sheets, and I don't want to go through this because I want to keep the videos approximately 10 minutes, and we've already reached that, is now for each structure, note that I go through and I have a set of questions. I have all three kinds of questions asked that try to link in with the material, but ask definitional, rational, and implicational. And also for each structure is represented by at least one of those strategic areas that I list. Again, what are the last parts of structure of survey? Well, we have a literary form. This is obviously a genealogy. An atmosphere, give a couple of adjectives. I call this formal and terse. What else would you say about a genealogy? And then I have some major impressions there. Again, I invite your questions, but that's our initial survey. I hope this presentation was helpful. Again, study the notes carefully and ask any questions that you have. Thanks a lot, and I hope you have a wonderful day.